Your writing and speaking has this kind of focus on psychological healing and psilocybin in a lot of it, at least. Um, and I see a kind of a lot of parallels with my own journey with kind of psychedelic healing. So maybe we can begin, if you don't mind, with the kind of deep backstory of where your kind of healing journey began.
Hmm. Uh, wow, the deep backstory. I'd say, my immediate impulse when I get asked about the backstory is sort of like almost like my eyes roll back in my head and I'm like, oh, not again. But then I also get, I'm like, okay, my journey makes sense because it contextualizes what I have to say to the people who are listening and sort of like create some sort of merit or authority for the ideas that I have that then serves the larger arc of the conversation. But then I'm also like, oh yeah, okay, I did this thing. You can hear about it in many other places. So I'm going to kind of give like the abridged version. I think that's using it correctly, um, which is that I was a casual recreational user of substances, in particular um, cannabis and occasionally psilocybin mushrooms, up until I was about 20-ish. Oh, and I not so occasionally was a recreational user of the drug alcohol. You might have heard of it. It's really widely available here where I live. Um, and yeah, then in my early 20s, I got into a culture and a context that led me to taking quite a lot of different substances in a very sort of like seemingly intentionally reckless journey, or a reckless manner. And that sort of started off after my first LSD journey. I think it was at Ozora Festival in 2016, or maybe it was 2017. I think it was 2016. I gave a talk that outlined this whole journey very, very well. But I had an LSD experience while I was depressed and like just feeling really down on myself while I was out in Australia. And I kind of like was just crying into my hands. Not crying. I I said crying, but I sort of used it in this sort of like ancient callback to misogynistic kind of mentality that most men I think grew up with, which is like crying's for girls, crying is blah. But what I actually meant to say was I was whining, I was whining about my life, um, and then I got shot out of my body, um, and realized, like, looked down, I was like, wow, I am I am propagating the suffering of my life by continuously repeating a narrative that isn't even necessarily true. And I could change that narrative at any time and have a totally different life. And I like came back into my body and I was like, actually looked my head up and went, whoa, you know. Um, and then that sort of changed the course of things for me because I was like, I can be anyone I want. I will no longer be Canada James. I'll be Australia James. The context of my use at the time, the context of my community, and a lot of maybe underlying factors that I didn't quite recognize was there. I didn't really have a language or an awareness to see them. I was under 25. I'm not sure my self-awareness circuits were even fully on. But then throughout a course of time, I ended up taking quite a lot of drugs very recklessly until I hit sort of a wall also with LSD that was like, hey, you're addicted to drugs. Or it was more like me in the middle of a profound moment, one of the sort of like peak LSD type experiences that people really like call after. You're just like in it, you're in this pocket of infinity. And I was in this pocket of infinity inside of a vehicle locked so that my other friends at the festival couldn't mess with me. And I'm looking and I'm panning a light across the dash. And as I pan the light across the dash, I could see the dust, but I could also see the dust all the way down to the molecular level, and it was all just incredible fractals. And meanwhile, I'm having this cacophony of thoughts that were just streaming through in a way that made absolutely no sense. I was completely disoriented conceptually or mentally, intellectually, and profoundly in awe with the wonder of what I was seeing. And then at some point, something crystallized and it kind of came up as a bubble. I was like as if something was wrong. And then it just came out of my mouth. I'm addicted to drugs. And then my whole nervous system was like, whoa, holy shit, that's true. And that sort of started a journey of me wanting to figure out how to not have this relationship to these substances, which, abridged. So skipping over a bunch of stuff, I end up back in Canada. I end up trying, mostly unsuccessfully, and still struggling, eventually getting to a place where the drugs were out of my life. That sort of cultural space where it was really easy for me to access it was also out of my life. I was back home in Canada. I was living with my parents back from traveling at like 23. I landed in their basement, right? And I realized I was just suffering a lot. And through listening to Terence McKenna and having done a lot of reading of Terence McKenna and others sort of like who were big names at the time, a lot has grown since this is 2009, 2010. I decided I would start taking psilocybin as a way to heal myself, even though I had only just like the idea that it was possible. I didn't really have some sort of cultural, like, yeah, they can heal you, but nothing of any substantial measure. I had read some Jiddu Krishnamurti and a number of other things that were informing the way I was thinking about it, but I had no basis in psychology or anything. And I just started exploring, and then I would have experiences that felt like they offered me a certain thing. And I did it once a month, every month for 13 months. And after each journey, I took a lot of time to try to understand what had happened to me, how do I apply it. And in that time, I started reading a lot of psychology and Jung and all these things to sort of piece together an understanding. And on the other side of it, I was in a really healthy way. I mean, I was still 24-year-old man-ish almost, maybe, so it wasn't exactly like I stepped into my like full adult maturity, but I was on the other side of that depression in a way that was very liberating. There are more events from there that sort of led me into another sort of like trauma zone. There's some connection to ayahuasca there and blah, blah, blah. But coming out of the mushroom work, I developed this relationship with the mushroom and a framework for understanding it, that when I would share it with my friends who were confused about their mushroom experiences, every single one of them said after that, all their experiences started to make a lot more sense, and that it really positively impacted them. And then on another journey, the mushrooms told me I should write a book. I wrote Decomposing the Shadow. The story could keep going on and on and on, but that's sort of like the foundation. So 10 years ago-ish, that's where all of this came from. And now fast forward 10 years and I am the person as described in my bio. Yeah.
So it's really interesting, the shift from recreational use to kind of therapeutic use, or whatever term you favor. And it makes sense, I guess. So you're saying, Terence McKenna as this articulate ethnobotanist, right, who's very much in favor of naturally occurring psychedelics as opposed to things like LSD, which, more semi-synthetic. It makes sense, like, that it was you return to psychedelics with this new conceptual, new kind of lens of what you thought they were capable of, right? Did it seem strange at the time to kind of re-engage with these substances in a way? If you're trying to heal addiction, it seems kind of like that could be quite a scary path to go down.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I'd say like my addiction, and I try to make this clear when I talk about it, was contextually, I was the most addicted to drugs I ever was, and hopefully ever will be, and it was incredibly destructive in my life. Comparatively, I wasn't, I wasn't living in a gutter. I wasn't homeless and using unsafe heroin and unsafe practices. There's no judgment coming from me. That wasn't my situation. That would be a much more intense sort of expression of addiction. I had been smoking things that I probably shouldn't have been smoking, but I wasn't, I wasn't using meth for days and days on end, for example. No judgment against that, but like compared to those types of addicted situation, mine was much more minimal, but it was very intense for myself in my own life, and there was a lot of reading of Leary and McKenna and Strassman and Huxley, and at the time, like during the sort of deep exploration, because I saw myself still as an explorer. I saw myself like, yeah, I'm a psychedelic warrior essentially, right? And I also take a bunch of other drugs because fuck yeah, let's get it. But at the time, it felt like intellectual justifications for reckless behavior. And then later they became the intellectual foundations by which I came to understand psychedelics in a much more, for myself, much more mature way, or from a much more mature place. No judgments against people who want to use drugs recklessly or recreationally. I feel like that should be a person's right to do that, with cause no harm being a central sort of rule. Um, but yeah, so there was a weirdness about the idea of like, I'm going to use drugs to fix my drug problem. But if I went to a doctor, it would be something similar anyways. And so, and in Decomposing the Shadow, I talk about my perception of the difference between antidepressants, SSRIs, and psilocybin, which, fast forward now 10 years, is a fairly accurate description before anyone was talking about it. But so it's like, that feels nicely validating. Um, but yeah, I had the sense that there was something different about the mushrooms. There was something different about them. I thought ayahuasca, but I had no access and I didn't have any money. So, either it was circumstance or it was some sort of like underlying synchronistic structure to the universe, the synchronicity mycelia of my life bore the fruit of the mushroom for me, I guess. But yeah, it was weird, but also it turned out to be, like you would know. I mean, drug use has a lot to do with context, a lot more to do with context than with the drugs itself, and a different context produces widely different results. And I didn't know what kind of context I was building. I just kind of had a sense of what I was asking for.